Well, it's another very warm welcome back, all my intrepid vintage dirt bike enthusiasts, and naturally the very warmest of welcomes to all of you who continue to support my classic dirt bike TV channel. Now, as I've still yet not attended a single off-road race event here in the UK during 2020 because of the dreaded coronavirus, we're going to continue with our series of bikes from the paddock and show you some more classics from years gone by. So I do hope you'll stick around for the next few minutes as we unearth another small collection of those fantastic vintage race bikes. Okay, first up we are going to check out this ancient 1948 old matchless 350. Now, this was a bike that I spotted at the 2017 Nostalgia Scramble some while back, and as you can see it's much more like an old trials bike than a vintage scrambler. Now, I know nothing at all about who the owner is of this bike, and I'm not even sure if this bike was originally an old trials bike or that it was actually made into an off-road bike from an old road going machine. But as all classics go, it's still a nice old motorcycle, that's for sure. But the chances are that it was taking part in the Nostalgia Trials event, as it was normally held the day before the Scrambles event at the very same home farm race venue. But as you're probably aware, Matchless were one of the oldest British motorcycle manufacturers based in Plumstead in London. And they manufactured motorcycles between 1899 and 1966, and in fact Matchless won the first ever single cylinder race at the Isle of Man in 1907. Of course, Matchless later became part of AMC, which were of course associated motorcycles, and that was in 1938. But they were a British company with a good pedigree for building quality motorcycles, and have a history as one of the British greats. But our particular example, whether it's authentic or not, is still essentially an old rocker, and you can't help but admire the owner for keeping the bike on the track. And when you consider that this old dog's now clocking on to 72 years old now, it's probably testament to the Matchless Motorcycle Company and their machines that this bike is still being used in this modern day. But it certainly does look to me like it's been put together from an old road bike with that Springer seat and weird looking exhaust and fuel tank, but I'm certainly not knocking it, and I think it's great to see a 72-year-old motorcycle still being ridden. Now, this was another lovely bike that I came across at the 2019 Revival Scramble, and again, I don't know the owner of the bike, but it's a cracking looking old 4-stroke TT500 Yamaha. But basically this bike was another of those smash and grab kind of bikes, whereby I just happened to come across it on my travels and then grabbed my camera and took a few pictures and video clips of the bike. Although I have to say I'd love to have had more information on the bike on the day, although the owner at this time was nowhere to be seen as I shot these short video clips. But it does look very suspiciously like an older TT 500 motor that's been shoehorned into this lovely Yamaha chassis. Now, my watchword when it comes to classic dirt bikes is always that if the bike looks right, then it generally goes right. And in this particular case, this big 4-stroke certainly ticks all the boxes in that respect. Now, that big single-cylinder Yamaha engine certainly seems to have undergone some upgrades with the barrel fin removal and a few other improvements, as you can see, although as I couldn't talk to the owner on the day, I'm not really privy to what was actually done on this big 4-stroke single motor. But even in their standard trim, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you how big and powerful these long stroking Yamaha motors were back in the day. But this is certainly a big, powerful, intimidating power plant when you look at it, and I can only imagine what this bike sounds like when it gets fired up. Now, with regards the profab side of this bike is concerned, I'm assuming that this is a sponsor of some sorts for the rider, and if that is the case, then he certainly found a nice bike to add his name to. But without doubt, this is a gorgeous looking bike with its long fork legs and those very high quality YSS rear shocks. And just standing still, this bike looks like it's heading down the track at a rate of knots. But it would have been quite good to get more video and pictures of the bike on the day, although unfortunately I had so much to see and do on that day, and I was just trying to get through as many bikes as I possibly could. Okay, next up we are back to the Scottish Classic Club race event at Penrith in 2019 when I spied this little 250 Tm Suzuki. And this is another tidy little classic, although it did have some non-original parts fitted to it, but nevertheless, for somebody that wanted an old TM to do a restoration on, this bike would have been an excellent starting point. Now, with regards to this bike's year of manufacture, I'm not really sure, but I'll stick my neck out again and say it's a 1972 model, but then again I'm really just guessing. But the bike still appears to have a certain amount of proper Suzuki parts still fitted to it, but again we're looking at the bike's good side, and she's not really that pretty viewed from the other. But firstly, I suspect that the original exhaust systems for these old TM Suzukis are not that easy to find these days, and as you can see that this particular owner has been burning the midnight oil making a functional header pipe for his bike. Although rather than do the same for the tailpipe, it looks like he's found this old exhaust from an old Yamaha RD 250 LC road bike and then just bolted it on. But this part's more than likely a lot heavier than the Suzuki original, and you can see that a lot of thought has gone into making that mounting bracket to bolt it to the top of the frame, although it may look functional, but it's not really the prettiest of sights. But of course we can't knock the rider for that, because he's turned to and made his own parts for his old Suzuki to get him back on the track, so who am I to criticise anybody? But I expect this bike won't be the quickest around the track on the day, but you can guarantee that this rider will be having just as much fun on his own machine as someone else on a more expensive bike. Okay, next up is the turn of this very nice Honda CR250 Elsinore that I came across at the Kendal Revival Scramble in 2018. Now, the bike was actually on display in the concourse judging arena, and I'm not really sure who owned it, but I think it had something to do with Chris Winder, who races these little Honda Elsinores in the pre-1974 British Championship events. But these little 250 Elsinores are absolutely legendary in the off-road motocross world and have iconic status, especially in the United States, where of course these bikes were named after the big Elsinore Grand Prix, and it was reputed to be Honda's first proper purpose-built motocross machine, which was announced to the world in 1972 before it was then put on sale in March the following year. But our particular example has had some modifications done to its carb inlet, and it does look like this new alloy inlet flange that was fitted was to enable it to take a different reed valve of some description, although it's certainly different from the original stock Honda part. Now, a nice little set of graphics on the bike's side panels featuring a few Elsinores and their gas tanks. Now, not of course for racing purposes, you understand, but just something different to look at when the bikes are put on display. The famous Elsinore fuel tank, and original items of these can fetch good money for any tanks that are undamaged. Now, of course, after these bikes were first launched, Honda employed the services of a certain Steve McQueen in a big advertising campaign, and sales of these Elsies then went through the roof. And when they first hit the racetracks, these 250s had a fantastic two-stroke motor which had exotic magnesium engine casings, and the overall bike was one of the lightest motocross machines on the planet at the time. Now, if you didn't want to buy a 250 LC, you could then go on and buy a 125, which was still a good little machine, and again, American teenagers just lusted after these bikes as a huge upsurge in young riders then came about who raced these smaller bikes in the 125 class. But these 250 Elsinores are still pretty damn quick bikes and very collectible, and this example we're looking at here is a good looking rendition of one of those legendary motorcycles. Okay, next up, this is another bike that I spotted at the 2019 Revival Scramble, and allegedly this is a 360 Mugen Honda, although I couldn't actually verify that fact on the day I shot these clips, as I never had any conversation with the bike's owner. But it may just be another old CR250 Honda motor with a couple of Mugen badges stuck on it, because as I remember, the Mugen Hondas had a different motor and certainly a different cylinder head from the one that's pictured here. But then again, Mugen Hondas were never my speciality, as they were the top bikes of the late 1970s and early 80s, and as I recall, were hugely expensive, often costing up to 3 times as much as a run-of-the-mill stock Honda 250 Red Rocket in that particular year. But my guess is that this is a Mugen Honda wannabe that the owners just dressed up to look like a more expensive Honda racer. Now, the motor certainly looks like a stock CR250, but if I'm wrong, then I do apologise, although, as I said, I'm no authority on these Mugen race bikes, but I do know that there weren't a huge amount of them made, and it was only the best of riders who had major sponsorship or a bit of cash behind them who could afford them. But this example is still a nice old twin-shock racer, despite its dubious pedigree. Okay, lastly, in this particular paddock video, I came across this rather tasty old 1980 RM250 Suzuki that was actually advertised for sale when I saw it at a Scottish Classic race event at Penrith in 2019. Now, whether the bike was actually sold on the day, I'm not really sure, but it certainly looked like it had undergone some kind of restoration or refurbishment, because it was in fantastic condition when I came across it. Now, as you know, these 1980 RM250 air-cooled two-strokers were, of course, the last of the air-cooled Suzuki motocross models, as a year later Suzuki then switched to water cooling when they introduced the RM125 in 1981. But nevertheless, these were still quite good bikes and were quite popular with many club riders. Now, okay, they were maybe not as agile as a 250 Honda Red Rocket or as quick, but they still did a decent job of trying to keep up with faster bikes on the racetrack. Now, as you've no doubt guessed, our featured bike is not a fully original example, as it has a different set of rear shocks. It's got different foot pegs and of course a pair of black wheels, which these bikes never had in 1980. But for me personally, the black wheels do spoil the look of an otherwise very nice little twin shock Suzuki. What price the actual owner was asking for the bike on the day, I'm not sure, although I suspect it wouldn't be cheap, as more and more of these older twin shockers are now fetching decent money these days, especially if it's a rare example or one that's been restored to a decent level. But despite the non-original black wheels, this is still a very nice bike, and it would certainly make a good weekend racer if the price was right to the potential buyer. But despite what we've said, these RM250s were still very good little bikes, but it was still quite hard work if you wanted to be Johnny Holeshot and be first into turn one, as you had to wring the bike's neck to get enough horses to pull you along at a race winning speed. Although if you were a top rider and power and agility was everything for your particular requirements, then maybe this little RM250 was not the particular bike for you. But this is a decent refurbishment on this 1980 example, and certainly a nice addition to anyone's classic dirt bike collection. So anyhow, I do hope you've enjoyed this latest browse around the paddocks, and if these are the kind of old race bikes you like viewing here on YouTube, then please consider subscribing to my channel. So once again, look out for more old vintage race bikes coming soon, and thanks again for taking the time to watch Classic Dirt Bike TV.